Nearly halfway into the season and Kyle Busch has 0 playoff points. Jimmie Johnson finds himself once again near the playoff cut line with only 10 races left in the NASCAR regular season. I thought it'd be great to look at the point standings and talk about who's on the hot seat. How's it going, y'all? My name is Eric and welcome to Out of the Groove. They say time flies when you're having fun. Well, time also flies when you're racing 3 races a week sometimes. It feels like only yesterday NASCAR ended the West Coast swing, 4 races into the Cup Series season, and now, all of a sudden you look up at the schedule, we are nearly halfway through the entirety of the 2020 season, and we only have 10 races left in the regular season, so it's getting into crunch time, y'all. The months of June and July often drag on, aren't super exciting. It's a weird midpoint in the season where the excitement from the beginning of the season has already worn off, and we're not quite though into playoff mode for the end of the season, so it's kind of just the months of June and July are usually forgettable, outside of a few specific races. But this year, with double headers and just races almost every day of the week, there's an Xfinity race last night, there's another Xfinity race tonight. I mean, schedule's all over the place. There's so many races every single week, every single weekend. And with all this chaos, all of a sudden we have mowed our way through much of the 2020 season. The Cup Series is still on pace to run all 36 races, including the All-Star race here in just a few days. But now with only 10 races left in the regular season, the playoff grid, the point standings, if you will, are starting to kind of take shape, and we're starting to really find out who the contenders are, who the pretenders are, who's on the bubble, who's on the hot seat, and who's maybe been a disappointment this year, because there are some names I can think of. Today, I want to look at the playoff grid as well as some of the other drivers on the outside looking in that are certainly still contenders to be reckoned with, and I want to give you guys my thoughts on who's in the most trouble and who's feeling pretty good right now. So let's look at the top 16 in the NASCAR Cup Series points as of now, 16 races into the season going into Kentucky. And here you have it. Obviously, the drivers highlighted there all have wins, so they are all but locked into the playoffs at this point. Denny Hamlin and Kevin Harvick lead the series with 4 wins apiece. Denny Hamlin has 23 playoff points over Kevin Harvick's 22. He has 1 extra stage win, that means. Then the Penske guys, Logano and Keselowski, doing pretty well. Chase Elliott, Alex Bowman, Martin Truex, Ryan Blaney, likely locked into the playoffs at this point, as long as we don't get 10 different winners over the next 10 weeks. I think they'll be pretty much safe. The top driver without a win right now is Aric Almirola, who has been on quite a roll in recent weeks. Kyle Busch, the defending series champion, which we'll talk about in just a few moments, is winless at this point and actually has 0 playoff points total, but he has a good points cushion over 17th place. Kurt Busch, Matt DiBenedetto, Clint Bowyer, Hendrick teammates William Byron and Jimmie Johnson still have a decent cushion over 17th place, and then right on that bubble line, Austin Dillon is currently the last driver in the playoffs if they were to start right now. Erik Jones, in a contract year for Joe Gibbs Racing, is just behind him. Rookie Tyler Reddick is 16 points behind 16th place, his teammate. And then a surprise in 19th, Bubba Wallace having himself a career year, a huge improvement for that 43 team. They are knocking on the door of a possible playoff spot here late in the season, late in the regular season, I should say, but there you have it. There's your top 16 points, as well as a few drivers just below the cut line. Now, what I want to do in this video is go through a lot of the names I just mentioned, specifically the drivers who are not locked in just yet, drivers without a win, and I want to tell you guys about where they're headed, what their chances are, and what these next few weeks are going to look like for them, and kind of who I have the most faith in versus who I'm a little skeptical about, because I don't think everyone in the top 16 necessarily is going to stick around there for too much longer. So let's get to it. Let's have some fun. I want to start with Aric Almirola, the #1 guy without a win this year. He is 111 points above the cut line right now. I'm pretty sure he's locked in, barring just an epic collapse, an epic catastrophe these next 10 weeks. Aric Almirola will likely make the playoffs this year, which is a big deal for him. He is technically still in a contract year. He does not have an extension signed for 2021 or beyond. Chances are Smithfield will stick around and he will stay in that 10 car. I haven't heard a whole lot of rumblings around his name, but right now nothing is 100% definite for that 10 team, and he is the hottest team in NASCAR right now outside of maybe Kevin Harvick. Aric Almirola is certainly Almirolaing at this moment. He has 5 straight top 5 finishes, and that's actually a career high for him as far as most top 5s in a season. He's accomplished that just in the last 3 weeks, so he is red hot right now. There's no denying Aric Almirola has speed. SHR as a team seems to have speed, with Kevin Harvick winning a couple races in the last 2 weeks. Cole Custer just got his best career finish last week at Indianapolis Motor Speedway, so the SHR Fords clearly have started to figure it out. They are nearing the top of the podium every single week, and Aric Almirola, a veteran driver, is right there taking advantage of it. So I've been very impressed with Aric Almirola. He's going to stick around. He is really not in any pressure of missing the playoffs. What's really important for Aric Almirola, though, if he really wants to make a run this year, I know 2 years ago he made it to the round of 8 in his first year with SHR, and that was impressive. He blew my expectations out of the water that year. But if he really wants to look like a contender, really wants to make a name for himself, he needs to win a race before the playoffs. He needs more playoff points to his name, because with guys like Harvick and Hamlin up over 20 points, you got the Penske guys in double digits with their playoff points. Like, those points carry over throughout every round of the playoffs except the championship race. And especially once you get to the round of 12, round of 8, those playoff points are important. And so Aric Almirola needs to gather a few more. Winning is the best way to do it. You get 5 playoff points for winning a race. He needs to get a win here before these playoffs really get rolling if he wants to make a deep run, in my opinion. But still, very impressive so far for Aric Almirola. Let's move on to one of the bigger surprises, and I would say in a bad way, I would say one of the biggest disappointments this year. Defending champion Kyle Busch is winless 16 races into the Cup Series season. Not only that, like I said earlier, he has 0 playoff points right now. Like, that's unheard of. No stage wins, no race wins. This is not the Kyle Busch that's won 2 championships in the last 5 years, was arguably the best driver of the 2010s decade. I mean, he's had a great year. He has 7 top 5s, 9 top 10s. I mean, not Kyle Busch level, not up to Kyle Busch's standards, but by any other measurement, Kyle Busch has had a pretty good year so far. He just has not gotten the win to show for it. He hasn't quite looked like himself at all times. You know, he's made mistakes like at Darlington when he wrecked Chase Elliott and got the bird thrown at him. And even in some of his Xfinity races this year, I was surprised. In his Xfinity debut this year at Phoenix, he got beat straight up by Brandon Jones and Harrison Burton. I mean, in basically the same equipment. That's not the Kyle Busch I'm used to seeing, getting beat by teenagers. That's unusual. My point is, Kyle Busch has not looked like Kyle Busch this year much at all. He is consistently a top 5 threat, but he's not a winning threat. He's only led 130 laps so far this year, compared to last season when he led nearly 1,600 laps. I mean, he's pretty far off that pace. And if you subtract Bristol earlier this year, where he led 100 laps, and Bristol's a short track, so it's easy to rack up a lot of laps led there. If you subtract the 100 laps he led there and didn't win, he's only led 30 laps at the other 15 races. That is not Kyle Busch. That's not the Kyle Busch we're used to seeing. And it's unclear why Kyle Busch is struggling this year. Joe Gibbs Racing clearly seems to know what they're doing. Denny Hamlin leads the series, or is tied for the lead, with 4 wins. Martin Truex Jr., with a new crew chief this year, has a win. It's weird that the defending champion, who is still running with the same crew chief he had last year, the rules package of the intermediates has not changed from the package he won the championship with last year. And the short track package this year is actually closer to what Kyle Busch likes than what was run last year. So in theory, the car should be exactly what Kyle Busch is looking for this year. The numbers, the results should be pouring in for Kyle Busch this year, but they're not. So it's a little weird. It's a little unclear as to why. That being said, when you look at him in the points, he's 107 points to the good. He's going to make the playoffs, no doubt about it. But similar to Aric Almirola, Kyle Busch, for him, it's championship or bust. At this point, finishing 3rd in the points means nothing to Kyle Busch in the grand scheme of things. He's out to get more championship rings. And having 0 playoff points with only 10 races to go in the regular season, when you look at guys like Hamlin, Harvick, Logano, who have 15, 20, 25 playoff points at this point, Kyle Busch is in a pretty deep hole. Obviously, once the playoffs roll around, he can just win a race at the right time and lock himself into the next round. But do you really want to put that much pressure on yourself? It'd be nice if you had a couple dozen playoff points to kind of play with during the first couple rounds of the playoffs. But right now, it looks like Kyle Busch isn't going to have that luxury, and that added bit of pressure, that added bit of stress, I don't know. Will Kyle Busch be able to overcome that? Come playoff time, we don't know. It's weird to see Kyle Busch without any playoff points nearly halfway through the Cup Series season. That's surprising to me, and definitely not the champion Kyle Busch we are used to seeing. So keep an eye on Kyle Busch. Of course, we're going to Kentucky this weekend, where he's run well at in the past. He could very well snap the losing streak this weekend and make me look silly, but we've been saying that for a few weeks now. Went to Pocono, didn't win at Pocono. Went to Indy, couldn't win at Indy. We've been saying it for weeks now, and it hasn't happened. So it'll be curious to see how long this losing streak goes on for Kyle Busch. If you really look at it, in the last 13 months, going back to last year, he only has 1 win in the Cup Series. And of course, it was Homestead last year, the championship race, so it was the most important one, but only 1 win in over a year. That is not Kyle Busch. So we'll see if this losing streak continues, or if Kyle Busch can start to rack up some points, very important playoff points, heading into the postseason. I want to talk about some drivers a little bit further down. Let's talk about Matt DiBenedetto for a moment. This is his first year in the Wood Brothers Racing number 21 car with some Penske technical alliance there. And as far as where he's sitting in the points right now, that's about what we expected from Matt DiBenedetto this year. This is looking like his first year to possibly make the playoffs. Huge moment for Matt DiBenedetto. It'll be the first time that Wood Brothers Racing has been in the playoffs since Blaney drove it a couple years back. That being said, I will say the results so far have not been quite as impressive as I would like to see from Matt DiBenedetto. He only has one top 5 this entire season so far, and it was early in the year at Las Vegas. He peaked early and really hasn't shown much speed, at least not consistent speed since then. So that's really what I'm looking at for Matt DiBenedetto is consistency. Nobody has Matt DiBenedetto picked to win the championship this year. He still needs to win a race. He still does not have a win in his Cup Series career. Win a race first. That had to be the first goal on their season's to-do list. I'm sure they'd like to make a deep run in the playoffs. I think they're capable of making a fairly deep run in the playoffs, but they're going to need to rack up some playoff points to make that easier on themselves once we get into playoffs time. But yeah, the results have not been quite what I was hoping for Matt DiBenedetto, but as far as where he sits in the points, pretty decent. I think they should be pretty pleased with where they're at. Plus 59 points right now, I'd say he's in a pretty good position, but don't let your guard down too much. With the way stage racing is these days, you can make up 30 or 40 points on somebody pretty quickly if they have a bad day or if you have a really good day. So 59 points looks big on paper, but there's still 10 races to go, so don't get too comfortable just yet, Matt DiBenedetto fans. I don't mean to pass by guys like Kurt Busch, who I think is, again, a lock to make the playoffs at this point. It'd be nice to see him get a win or two, if possible, to give himself an actual shot at, a deep playoff run, perhaps, but I'm not too worried about Kurt Busch. I also don't mean to skip over Clint Bowyer too much. Similar to Kurt Busch, I need to see wins if I really want to see the 14 car make a deep playoff run. It's one thing to make the playoffs, it's another thing to go to the round of 8, for example, or the championship 4. And I've definitely not seen consistent speed out of the 1 or the 14 cars for me to think that they are championship contenders, but this could be Clint Bowyer's last season in the NASCAR Cup Series, so it'd be nice to see him go out on a high note. I noticed this past weekend in Indianapolis, all the SHR cars seem to be running really well, except Clint Bowyer. He seemed to be a little bit off the pace, so that was a bit concerning to me. He'll probably make the playoffs looking at where he's at, but he's one of those drivers, if I had to look at those guys, below 13th or so, I don't know if I entirely trust him. Clint Bowyer, remember his first year with SHR back in 2017? He missed the playoffs entirely. That was pretty surprising, pretty disappointing. I'm sure he's run better since then. He won a couple races in 2018, but I would say in general, Clint Bowyer's time with Stewart-Haas Racing has been a little bit of a disappointment. It's been a bit underwhelming. That's just the truth of it. But it'd be nice to see him go out on a high note this year, if this is indeed his last year. He's in a contract year. I know people are speculating that he might retire and go into the broadcast booth, but he could stay in NASCAR. He could stay with Stewart-Haas. He could go to another race team in the Cup Series, but good chance this is his last year in the 14. Would like to see him go out strong. I want to talk about the 2 Hendrick cars near the bubble there next. Let's talk about William Byron, currently plus 38. Not a huge gap there. He's hanging by a thread. William Byron's another driver who has disappointed me a little bit this season. 16 races in, he has 0 top 5s. His best finish this year is 7th, and it came at Pocono a couple weeks back, one of his best racetracks. So that's pretty disappointing so far. Right now, his average finish for this season is 3 positions worse than it was in 2019. William Byron's still extremely young, but he's working with 7-time champion crew chief Chad Knaus, and maybe the lack of practice, the fact that they haven't run any practice sessions, any qualifying since the season resumed in mid-May, perhaps that's hurting them. Perhaps that's hurting their communication. William Byron being a younger driver, perhaps not having as many laps under his belt historically, is having a harder time communicating with Chad Knaus about what he needs. Perhaps Chad Knaus, he's won a lot of races, a lot of championships, but he's never had to race under these conditions in the NASCAR Cup Series. Could be something new. It may not play to his strengths. Overall, something about that 24 car just doesn't seem right. They're, in my opinion, clearly the weakest link at Hendrick Motorsports, which when you look at William Byron being the youngest driver in the field, or on the team at least, it's not entirely shocking. Man, last year they were making strides, especially late in the season. It looked like, hey, that 24 team is this close to winning a race. We haven't seen anything close to winning speed from the 24 team this year, especially not consistently. I'd like to see them make a couple runs at a race win at this point this year. I don't see a championship this year for the 24 team. I think they're right there on that bubble. I wouldn't be shocked. A bad race or two, they could easily drop out of the top 16 because there are some fast cars behind them. They're in the danger zone, and I think missing the playoffs would be a huge disappointment for a young driver that I think is expected to dramatically improve every single year. William Byron was dominant in trucks, dominant in Xfinity. He's come into the Cup Series, and much like many other young drivers the last few years, has just fizzled out and not really looked like anything special. These sound like harsh words, but I'm just being honest. Is anybody that excited about William Byron right now? I mean, I showed you guys the All-Star Race fan vote a few days ago. He's 4th in fan voting. A Hendrick Motorsports driver in the Flames, the 24 car, he's 4th in fan votes. I'm just saying people aren't excited about William Byron right now, and it's because he hasn't done anything in his now 2.5 years in the Cup Series. At some point, the results are going to have to start to improve, and the fact that 2020 has been a step backwards from 2019 has been a disappointment in my opinion. But that being said, he's still 14th on the playoff grid, in a decent spot, controls his own destiny, but with 10 races to go, Hendrick has not shown the same speed the last few weeks that they showed at the beginning of the season before the pandemic, so I'd be a little bit concerned about the 24 team if I was a fan of theirs right now. From one of the youngest drivers in the field to one of the oldest and most accomplished drivers in the field without a doubt, Jimmie Johnson, after really a worst case scenario at Indianapolis this last weekend, he finds himself 15th on the playoff grid, only 36 points to the good. Of course, Indianapolis, you'll remember he had to miss that race, which means he collected 0 driver points. That was because he was tested positive for COVID-19. He's back in the car, supposed to race this weekend at Kentucky, so hopefully looks like that was the only race he's going to have to miss. Good news there at least. But last week was pretty much worst case scenario because while Jimmie Johnson did not collect any points whatsoever, some of the other drivers behind him in the playoff battle, like Austin Dillon, Erik Jones, and William Byron, who I just talked about, played the stage game great and all gained max points in the first stage of this race, which certainly helped them boost themselves up into the standings. That's why Jimmie Johnson lost 3 positions by not racing last weekend in the overall point standings, which is a tough one to swallow, but it's not over yet. It just knocked him down into the danger zone. It didn't knock him out of the playoffs. He's still 15th. He's not even the last driver in at this point, and he still has a 36-point cushion. But now Jimmie Johnson, Cliff Daniels, the 48 team, they got to focus. No more messing around. They got to get down to business and start running well again here these last 10 races. They can't meander around 18th. They've had some tough breaks this year. You know, the disqualification at Charlotte a few weeks back, you know, cost them a second place finish, gave them last place points. That was a real gut wrencher. Of course, Darlington, when Jimmie Johnson wrecked at the end of the stage while leading, that was also a real gut punch for the 48 team. So Jimmie Johnson, of course, having to sit out Indianapolis, those are several massive gut punches that the 48 team has had to endure this season. Some wild card tracks coming up, including the Daytona road course, that perhaps could play to Jimmie Johnson's strengths and allow for some great finishes, some great results down the line. Overall, I would say 2020, statistically speaking, is tracking a little bit better than 2019 did. But I can't say it's been the serious jump that a lot of us expected, especially the way Jimmie Johnson at the end of last season and the beginning of this season, the way he's been talking up his new crew chief, Cliff Daniels. It made me think that old Jimmie Johnson was going to return this year. We were going to see a few wins. We were going to see a championship contending season. I was expecting big things, the way Jimmie Johnson was hyping up Cliff Daniels, and we have not seen that this year. They've had some good speed, especially early in the season, but it's teetered off in recent weeks, and Jimmie Johnson himself has made some mistakes, like Darlington, that we're not really used to seeing Jimmie Johnson make. So I'm still not sure what to make of the 48 team. I think they have just as good a chance of making it to the championship 4 as they do just missing the playoffs entirely at this rate. I think these next 10 weeks are completely up in the air. I don't know what to expect from the 48 team, but I'll give Jimmie Johnson the benefit of the doubt. Of course, I did that last year and he missed the playoffs, but I'll give Jimmie Johnson the benefit of the doubt, and I think his experience winning so many championships, so many races will pay dividends here. You look at the guys he's battling for these last playoff spots. He's battling William Byron, Austin Dillon, Erik Jones. He's practically old enough to be some of these guys' dads at this point. The experience will win out, in my opinion, and I think Jimmie Johnson will still qualify for the playoffs here in his final full-time season, but with missing last week's race due to illness, it's become a lot more difficult, or definitely more difficult here in the short term. But I'm confident in Jimmie Johnson. This season's been rough. This has not been the swan song season that he was probably promised, but I can't imagine he will miss the playoffs. He's not going to let that team miss the playoffs this year in his final season. So I have confidence in Jimmie Johnson, but it's going to be a big story to watch. Austin Dillon seems to be working really well with Justin Alexander this season. They've clearly made a serious improvement. Tyler Reddick has probably been the most exciting rookie to watch this year, the highest rookie currently in the point standings. I've seen Tyler Reddick's name thrown around in some interesting places in recent weeks. I would say his future with RCR is far from certain at this point, so there's a lot of interesting storylines to watch revolving those two drivers, the 3 and the 8, Reddick and Austin Dillon, not just for this season, but also how they set themselves up for next season and beyond. Richard Childress Racing's in an interesting place, but it's exciting to see their two cars looking somewhat competitive once again. Sandwiched right in between the two RCR cars, the first driver currently not in the playoffs is Erik Jones for Joe Gibbs Racing. Another driver, speaking of uncertain futures, is in a contract year. Reports say that he and Joe Gibbs have been negotiating a possible contract extension. It sounds like some of it hinges on Stanley DeWalt's extension as a sponsor if they stick around. Right now, Erik Jones is only 6 points back, and he's had a couple really rough finishes the last couple of weeks. He, of course, was involved in a wreck at Pocono and then blew a tire at Indianapolis, so those two DNFs have killed him in the points. That's what knocked him out of the top 16. He's still right there on the bubble, but man, Erik Jones, This is his third year with Joe Gibbs Racing, and every single year he seems to be flirting with that cut line. He's always on the bubble. Every single year when we get to July, he is right there in uncharted waters. I really do think Erik Jones is a very good young driver. I don't think he's as good or as consistent as Chase Elliott, for example, but I would put him on a similar pedestal as Ryan Blaney, for example, or even maybe Alex Bowman. I think he's in that same conversation with those drivers who are consistently playoff threats and have already won races this year. Erik Jones is in that mix, but he's so inconsistent, it's really hard to tell. And unfortunately, looking at his numbers for this season as far as top 5s, top 10s, laps led, average finish, right now 2020 is looking like his worst statistical season since he's gotten to JGR and got to that 20 car. Only slightly though. It's not like a huge drop, it's just a little bit worse than the last 2 years in that car. So that is disappointing. Much like William Byron, I want to see a young guy like Erik Jones consistently improve year to year, and it looked like he was doing that. You know, he won Darlington last year, the Southern 500, held off Kyle Busch to do it. I was impressed. I was very impressed this year in 2020, other than his almost comedic win in the Clash with that destroyed race car. Really haven't seen anything of note from Erik Jones this year, and that has been a bit disappointing for me personally, especially when you look at his teammate Denny Hamlin winning so many races. Martin Truex has a new crew chief. He still has a win. Kyle Busch, we just talked about, is not winning, but is still consistently a top 5 threat. Erik Jones, when they don't have issues, is top 5, top 10 on speed almost every week, but they have so many issues. Some of it's driver, some of it's not. It's just so hard to really peg where Erik Jones fits on this overall, hierarchy of drivers, you could say. He's right on the cut line. I'd like to say Erik Jones races his way into the playoffs, and with guys like Austin Dillon, who I don't fully trust in front of him, or William Byron, who is having a down year, Jimmy Johnson, unknown right there, there's a good chance Jones races his way back into the top 16. He's in a Joe Gibbs car. I'd be shocked if he misses the playoffs, but man, he's been flirting with danger the last couple of years. This could be the year he finally gets snake bit and might miss out. So keep an eye on Erik Jones. That's going to be an interesting battle because Jones is, once again, in a contract year. And if he misses the playoffs, I mean, they might have already signed a deal by then, but they're probably looking at a short-term deal right now for Erik Jones because they don't really trust him long-term just yet. He hasn't done enough to earn their trust long-term. He hasn't earned like a 4-year contract the way Ryan Blaney has for Penske. Let's look down at 19th on the playoff grid at the moment, Bubba Wallace. I mentioned this at the very beginning of the show, but Bubba Wallace is having an extremely impressive season. We knew in the offseason that Richard Petty Motorsports bought some new race cars, upgraded some of their equipment thanks to Worldwide Technology. Their major endorsement in the middle of last season has helped fund that team substantially, I would say. But Bubba Wallace right now is 42 points outside the top 16. He is still within striking distance where I think, if things go well, he could point his way in. More than likely, he needs to, highlight a few races and maybe play some fun strategies and try to get a win somewhere. He was top 10 in Indianapolis this last weekend, so I mean, a win's not completely out of the question for the 43 team the way they've been running this year. But you look at this year, he has an 18.7 average finish. I mean, last year, his average finish was like 23.9. So he's 5 positions better this year. And he's already matched his career high for top 10s in a season. He's got 3 top 10s this year. 43 team, it's trending like this. Yeah, there are a lot of external distractions around Bubba Wallace right now, but hey, at least the last couple of weeks with his results at Pocono and Indianapolis, doesn't look like he's let the distractions get to him too bad. Keep an eye on Bubba Wallace. That would be a huge story if he made the playoffs, of course. There's some other wild cards now a little bit further back, outside of the top 20 in points. The way the playoff system, the way the regular season system works, of course, with winning you're in, as long as you're in the top 30 in points, if you nab a win somewhere, you qualify for the playoffs, and that would completely shake up the top 16 if somebody further back were to get a win. And there are a few pretty decent drivers in pretty decent cars that I think you need to watch out for. Let's start with rookie Christopher Bell driving the 95 Toyota. He's back in the mid-20s in points, mainly due to a disastrous start to his rookie season. Mechanical failures, wrecks at the start of the year. It was awful the first, before the pandemic and even shortly after the pandemic. Awful start to the year for Christopher Bell. But since then, he started to figure things out just a little bit. He got his first top 5 of the season a couple weeks ago at Pocono. He also led his first laps of the season at Talladega a couple weeks ago. Remember, that is a Toyota with ties to Joe Gibbs Racing, so the speed, it's going to come around eventually. It looks like it's starting to come around. That is a car that can win races. A race. I don't know about plural races, but that car can find victory lane this year. We saw Matt DiBenedetto last year with not as good of a car almost win Bristol. Christopher Bell's a good driver. I think Christopher Bell can win in that car. It's unlikely. It's not going to be easy, but he can win. So keep an eye on Christopher Bell. He needs to win to get in the playoffs at this point. He's too far back to make it up on points, but keep an eye on that 95. Do not count him out just yet. And the same thing goes for Cole Custer, another rookie who is driving a very good Stewart-Haas Racing Ford. He also just got his first top 5 of the season at the Brickyard, so keep an eye on Cole Custer. I know he hasn't done a whole lot to stand out this year, but he is driving a Stewart-Haas car, and I've talked about in this episode already how Kevin Harvick has dominated recently. Aric Almirola is on fire. Clint Bowyer still solidly in the playoffs. The SHR Fords are fast, and Cole Custer very well might be able to take advantage of that if the stars align one of these next weekends. And the other driver outside the top 20 that certainly should not go unnoticed is, of course, Matt Kenseth. 3 straight top 12s for Matt Kenseth, including a second place finish just a few days ago at the Brickyard. And if he had won that race, that would have destroyed the playoff bubble as we know it. That would have been a huge disruptor if he had gotten that win, and he was this close. He was a restart away. He was dirty air away from possibly winning that race and shaking up the entire playoff grid. I know it took several weeks for that 42 car to start to show some speed with Kenseth behind the wheel, but these last couple weeks, Matt Kenseth has said he feels a lot more comfortable in the car. They've started to find setups that cater more to his driving style as opposed to Kyle Larson's driving style, which is what he was basically running before then, which I could have told you that wasn't going to work. They drive so differently. But Matt Kenseth is starting to get comfortable and almost won a crown jewel race just a few days ago, after only being back in the car for less than 2 months. Keep an eye on Matt Kenseth. There are some races coming up, some tracks coming up that he is good at, including Kentucky this past weekend. He has won at Kentucky. Keep an eye on that 42 car. Do not count him out. At the beginning of this year, everyone expected the 42 car to be in the playoffs because they expected Kyle Larson to drive it all year long. With the driver change early this season, that kind of went out the window, and that spot, the 42 spot in the top 16, sort of became a freebie. It sort of became up in the air, up for grabs. But now with Matt Kenseth starting to find his footing, he very well might get a win here in the next few weeks and reclaim that spot in the top 16, and that would, of course, shuffle things around there near the bubble. So keep an eye on Matt Kenseth. Keep an eye on the 2 rookies I mentioned as well outside the top 20. A 1 win is all it takes to make the playoffs these days. So do not count any of those drivers out, especially with Daytona being the final race of the regular season. That is going to be chaotic. That is going to be wild. But there you have it. Once again, here's a look at we'll say the top 20 in points. Of course, the top 16 make the playoffs. One last look. A lot of big names right there near the playoff bubble. Of course, last year, Jimmie Johnson missed the playoffs. That was a huge storyline. The first time in his historic career that he missed the postseason. I don't see it happening 2 years in a row, especially not in his swan song final year in the NASCAR Cup Series, but there are a lot of big names and big race teams on the outside looking in right now, and it's going to be interesting to watch these final 10 races, especially with some wild races like the Daytona Road Course, of course the Daytona Oval Race. There are some wild card races coming up here in the next few weeks. It's going to be fun to watch, but there you go. Those are your there's your point standings as of now with just 10 races to go in the regular season. Which of those drivers near the bubble make it in? Which of those drivers near the bubble fall out? Who makes the playoffs? Who doesn't? Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. That was fun. I had fun looking through all that. Subscribe if you are new. We talk about NASCAR almost daily on this channel. I might have to take a day or 2 off because I'm going to be traveling to Tennessee here this weekend. I'll be getting ready for the Bristol All-Star race. I'll be there Wednesday night to film a video showing you guys what it looks like at a NASCAR race during a pandemic. I'll be there with my mask and everything. It's going to be a great time. I'm excited for that. But yeah, I will still have plenty of videos up between now and then, and of course shortly thereafter, Kentucky this weekend, and then after Bristol, there's Texas, my typical home track. So gonna be some fun racing here coming up. But yeah, subscribe if you're new so you don't miss a thing. Follow me on Twitter, follow me on Instagram, and of course a big thank you to my Patreon supporters. I really and truly appreciate your continued support of me, support the show. Really means a lot. So thanks to you guys, I'm able to get out to racetracks like Bristol here in a few days and do videos there on the ground, show you guys what it's like. That would not be possible without the support I get from all of you on Patreon, so thank you very much. I'm super excited for next week. Gonna be fantastic. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you again very soon.